The air was thick with tension as Karen strode down the narrow aisle of the cramped economy cabin, her eyes scanning the rows of seats with a predatory gaze. She had already secured her spot in the overhead compartment for her oversized carry-on, and now her sights were set on the empty window seat beside a young woman clutching a medical bracelet. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" Karen demanded, her voice dripping with impatience. The young woman looked up, her eyes widening with a mixture of confusion and apprehension. "I'm sorry, but this seat is reserved for me. I have a medical condition that requires—" "Well, I need to sit here," Karen interrupted, her lips curling into an irritated sneer. "I paid good money for this flight, and I'm not going to sit in the middle just because you have some sort of medical condition." The young woman opened her mouth to protest, but before she could utter a word, a flight attendant appeared at Karen's side, her expression stern. "Ma'am, I'm afraid this seat is indeed reserved for the passenger with a medical bracelet," the attendant said firmly. "I'll have to ask you to find another seat." Karen's face flushed with indignation. "But I need to sit here. I can't be stuck in the middle," she argued, her voice rising in pitch. The flight attendant remained unflinching. "I understand your frustration, but this is a matter of medical necessity. If you continue to insist, I'll have to involve the captain." Karen opened her mouth to retort, but the stern look on the attendant's face made it clear that she was not going to back down. With a huff of exasperation, Karen turned on her heel and stormed down the aisle, muttering under her breath. As the young woman watched Karen's retreating figure, she couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. She had been dreading the confrontation, fearing that her medical condition would be dismissed or ignored. But the flight attendant had handled the situation with professionalism and compassion, refusing to cave to Karen's entitled demands. The plane began to taxi down the runway, and the young woman settled back into her seat, her mind still reeling from the encounter. She couldn't help but wonder how the rest of the flight would unfold, and whether Karen's behavior would have any further impact on her own journey. As the plane soared through the sky, Karen fumed in her aisle seat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She'd have been forced to settle for a less desirable location, and the sheer injustice of it all was eating away at her. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath, glaring at the back of the seat in front of her. "I paid the same amount as everyone else, and I deserve to be comfortable." The young woman with the medical bracelet, who was now comfortably settled in the window seat, couldn't help but overhear Karen's grumbling. She felt a pang of sympathy, but her own comfort and well-being were her top priority. Determined to avoid any further confrontation, the young woman decided to keep to herself and try to relax during the flight. She pulled out a book from her bag and became engrossed in the story, all the while trying to ignore the simmering tension in the cabin. But Karen's restlessness only seemed to grow as the minutes ticked by. She fidgeted in her seat, occasionally glancing over at the young woman with a look of barely concealed resentment. "Excuse me, flight attendant," Karen suddenly called out, her voice carrying across the aisle. "I need to speak with you." The same attendant who had dealt with the earlier incident quickly made her way to Karen's row. "Yes, ma'am. How can I help you?" "This is completely unacceptable," Karen declared, her eyes narrowing. "I should not have been forced to sit in this awful middle seat. I demand to be moved to a more suitable location." The flight attendant sighed, already anticipating the confrontation. "Ma'am, as I explained before, that seat is reserved for a passenger with a medical need. I'm afraid I can't accommodate your request." "But I'm a paying customer," Karen insisted, her voice rising in volume. "I have just as much right to be comfortable as anyone else on this plane." The young woman in the window seat cringed, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She knew that her medical condition was not the young woman's fault, but she couldn't help but feel guilty for causing such a disruption. As the argument between Karen and the flight attendant escalated, the tension in the cabin became palpable. The other passengers couldn't help but steal glances, their expressions ranging from annoyance to outright discomfort. Karen's demands only grew more insistent, her face flushed with anger. The flight attendant, however, remained resolute, unwilling to budge on the issue. It was clear that this confrontation was far from over. As the heated exchange between Karen and the flight attendant continued, the young woman in the window seat felt increasingly uneasy. She wanted nothing more than to fade into the background and avoid drawing any further attention to herself. But it was clear that Karen had no intention of backing down. "This is simply unacceptable," Karen shouted, her voice cutting through the muffled chatter of the other passengers. "I demand to be seated in a more suitable location, or I'll have your job." The flight attendant's expression remained stoic, but the young woman could see the frustration simmering beneath the surface. "Ma'am, I've already explained that this seat is reserved for a medical reason. I cannot move you, and I'd appreciate it if you'd lower your voice and refrain from making threats." Karen's eyes narrowed, and she opened her mouth to unleash another tirade. But before she could, a deep, authoritative voice interrupted her. "Is there a problem here?" The young woman looked up to see the captain of the plane, a stern-faced man with a commanding presence, standing at the end of the aisle. He had clearly been alerted to the commotion and had come to investigate. Karen's face flushed with embarrassment, but she quickly regained her bravado. "Yes, there's a problem. This flight attendant is refusing to move me to a better seat, and Ma'am," the captain cut her off, his voice calm but firm. "I've been informed of the situation, and I can assure you that the flight attendant is acting within the airline's policies. This seat is reserved for a passenger with a medical need, and it cannot be reassigned." Karen's mouth opened and closed, her words failing her for a moment. "But if you continue to disrupt the flight, I'll have no choice but to have you removed from the aircraft," the captain stated, leaving no room for argument. The young woman watched in stunned silence as Karen's face crumpled with a mixture of anger and humiliation. She opened her mouth to protest, but one glare from the captain was enough to silence her. Defeated, Karen slumped back into her seat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The flight attendant gave the captain a grateful nod and returned to her duties, leaving the young woman to marvel at the way the situation had been handled. As the plane continued its journey, the young woman couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. She had been spared the burden of dealing with Karen's entitled behavior, thanks to the unwavering professionalism of the flight crew. But she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger confrontation. As the plane continued its ascent, the lingering tension in the cabin was palpable. Karen sat fuming in her aisle seat, her eyes burning with resentment every time she glanced at the young woman in the window. The young woman, for her part, tried her best to avoid eye contact and focus on her book, but she couldn't shake the unease that had settled in the pit of her stomach. She knew that Karen's entitled behavior was not her fault, but the guilt of being the cause of such a disruptive scene weighed heavily on her. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the flight attendant returned to Karen's row, her expression cautious. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" she asked, her voice laced with a hint of concern. Karen's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. "No, everything is not all right," she spat. "I should not have been forced to sit in this middle seat, and I demand to be moved." The flight attendant sighed, already anticipating the confrontation. "Ma'am, as I've already explained, this seat is reserved for the passenger with a medical need. I'm afraid I can't accommodate your request." "But I paid good money for this ticket," Karen exclaimed, her voice rising in volume. "I deserve to be treated with the same respect as everyone else on this flight." The young woman in the window seat cringed, wishing she could disappear into the thin fabric of the seat. She hated being the center of such a public spectacle, and she couldn't help but worry that Karen's behavior would only escalate. The flight attendant remained steadfast, her expression unwavering. "Ma'am, I understand your frustration, but this is a matter of medical necessity. I'm afraid I cannot move you to another seat." Karen's face flushed with rage, and for a moment, The young woman feared that she might lash out physically. But before Karen could respond, a familiar voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" The young woman looked up to see the captain standing in the aisle, his gaze fixed on Karen with a stern expression. Karen's mouth opened and closed, the words seemingly stuck in her throat. "Aye. This is unacceptable." She finally managed to blurt out. The captain raised a hand, silencing her. "Ma'am, I've been informed of the situation, and I can assure you that the flight attendant is acting in accordance with our policies. This seat is reserved for a passenger with a medical need, and it cannot be reassigned." Karen's face crumpled with a mixture of anger and defeat. "But if you continue to disrupt the flight, I'll have no choice but to have you removed from the aircraft," the captain said, his voice leaving no room for argument. The young woman watched in stunned silence as Karen's bravado visibly deflated. She slumped back into her seat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, and the captain returned to the front of the plane, leaving the cabin in an uneasy silence. As the plane continued its journey, the young woman in the window seat found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on her book. The memory of Karen's outburst played over and over in her mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the confrontation was far from over. Karen, on the other hand, had retreated into a sullen silence, her gaze fixed out the window. The young woman couldn't help but wonder what was going through her mind. Was she plotting some sort of retaliation, or had the captain's stern warning finally sunk in? The minutes ticked by, and the tension in the cabin remained palpable. The other passengers seemed to sense the unease, glancing warily at Karen and the young woman as if they were caught in the eye of a brewing storm. Suddenly, a commotion erupted from the rear of the plane. The young woman craned her neck, trying to catch a glimpse of what was happening, but the aisle was blocked by a cluster of concerned passengers. "What's going on?" she asked the flight attendant who had been standing nearby, her brow furrowed with worry. The attendant's expression was grim. "It seems there's a medical emergency. We're asking all passengers to remain seated while we attend to this situation." The young woman's heart sank. She couldn't help but wonder if the medical emergency was somehow related to her own condition, and the thought of causing even more disruption to the flight filled her with dread. Karen, who had been eavesdropping on the conversation, suddenly sat up straight, her eyes alight with a strange glint. "Medical emergency, huh?" she murmured, a sly grin spreading across her face. The young woman watched with growing unease as Karen unbuckled her seatbelt and made her way towards the commotion, ignoring the flight attendant's protests. "Ma'am, please return to your seat," the attendant called out, her voice tinged with desperation. But Karen paid no heed, her focus solely on the situation unfolding at the back of the plane. The young woman gripped the armrests of her seat, her knuckles turning white, as she braced herself for the inevitable confrontation. Moments later, Karen's voice rang out, laced with a false sense of concern. "Oh my goodness, what's happening? Is there anything I can do to help?" The young woman's heart sank, realizing that Karen's intentions were anything but altruistic. She had a sinking feeling that the woman's entitled behavior was about to reach new heights, and she couldn't help but worry about the consequences that would follow. The young woman in the window seat watched in horror as Karen pushed her way through the crowd of concerned passengers, her false concern dripping with a sinister undertone. "Please, let me help," Karen exclaimed, her voice laced with false urgency. "I'm a trained medical professional, and I may be able to assist in this emergency." The flight attendant, who had been trying to maintain order and privacy around the medical situation, looked visibly flustered. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to return to your seat. We have the situation under control." But Karen refused to back down, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the scene. "I insist. As a paying customer, I have a right to be involved in ensuring the safety and well-being of my fellow passengers." The young woman cringed, watching the standoff unfold. She knew that Karen's true motivation had nothing to do with concern for the medical emergency and everything to do with her own selfish desires. The woman was clearly trying to exploit the situation to her advantage, and the young woman couldn't help but feel a sense of dread about what might happen next. Just then, the captain emerged from the back of the plane, his expression grave. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to return to your seat immediately," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. Karen's face flushed with indignation. "But I'm a trained medical professional, and I could be of assistance," she insisted, refusing to budge. The captain's gaze hardened. "I don't care what your credentials are. This is a private medical situation, and we have it under control. If you don't return to your seat right now, I'll have you removed from the aircraft." The young woman watched as Karen's resolve crumbled, her shoulders slumping in defeat. With a huff of frustration, she turned and made her way back to her seat, her eyes burning with resentment. As the captain returned to the rear of the plane, the young woman couldn't help but feel a twinge of sympathy for the flight crew. They had been forced to navigate a minefield of Karen's entitled behavior, and the young woman couldn't help but wonder how much more they would have to endure before the flight was over. The minutes ticked by, and the cabin remained tense and silent. The young woman tried to focus on her book, but her mind kept returning to the medical emergency and the looming possibility of further confrontation with Karen. As the plane approached its destination, the young woman couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. She had made it through the ordeal, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger battle. As the plane began its descent, the young woman in the window seat could feel the tension in the cabin ratcheting up once again. Karen had been sulking in her aisle seat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, and the young woman knew that it was only a matter of time before the woman's entitled behavior resurfaced. Sure enough, as the plane touched down and the seatbelt sign was turned off, Karen sprang to her feet, her eyes searching the cabin with a predatory gaze. "Excuse me, flight attendant," she called out, her voice dripping with impatience. "I need to speak with you immediately." The young woman cringed, bracing herself for the impending confrontation. The flight attendant, who had been dutifully overseeing the disembarking process, approached Karen's row with a weary expression. "How can I help you, ma'am?" the attendant asked, her tone carefully neutral. "I want to file a formal complaint against this airline," Karen declared, her chin held high. "I was completely disrespected and mistreated throughout this entire flight, and I demand compensation." The young woman felt her heart sink. She had known that Karen's entitled behavior would only escalate, and she couldn't help but worry about the potential consequences. The flight attendant sighed, already anticipating the onslaught. "Ma'am, I'm sorry you feel that way, but I can assure you that our staff was simply following standard protocol. The seat you were assigned was reserved for a passenger with a medical need, and we have a responsibility to." "I don't care about your protocols or your responsibilities," Karen interrupted, her voice rising in volume. "I paid good money for this ticket, and I deserve to be treated with respect and accommodated accordingly." The young woman watched as the flight attendant's expression hardened, her patience clearly wearing thin. "Ma'am, I'm afraid I can't discuss this matter with you here. If you have a formal complaint, I'd suggest speaking with our customer service representatives at the terminal." Karen's face flushed with indignation, and for a moment, the young woman feared that she might lash out physically. But before the situation could escalate further, a familiar voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" The young woman looked up to see the captain standing in the aisle, his arms crossed over his chest. Karen's mouth opened and closed, the words seemingly stuck in her throat. I was just trying to file a complaint," she finally managed to sputter. The captain's expression remained impassive. "I'm afraid that we'll have to wait until you've disembarked the aircraft. For now, I'd ask that you collect your belongings and exit the plane in an orderly fashion." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line, but she knew better than to argue with the captain. With a huff of frustration, She snatched her bag from the overhead compartment and stormed down the aisle, leaving the young woman and the rest of the passengers to watch in a mixture of relief and trepidation. As the passengers filed out of the plane, the young woman in the window seat couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Karen had stormed off the aircraft, her face flushed with rage, and the young woman couldn't help but wonder what the woman would do next. She made her way through the terminal, keeping a wary eye out for any sign of Karen. The last thing she wanted was to have to deal with the woman's entitled behavior once again. As she approached the baggage claim, the young woman was surprised to see a group of airport security officers gathered around a familiar figure, Karen. "Ma'am, you're going to need to come with us," one of the officers said sternly, his hand resting on his holster. Karen's face was a mask of fury, her eyes darting around the terminal as if searching for an escape route. "This is an outrage," she shouted, drawing the attention of the other passengers. "I demand to speak with your supervisor." The young woman couldn't help but feel a twinge of satisfaction as she watched the scene unfold. It seemed that Karen's entitled behavior had finally caught up with her, and the consequences were about to come crashing down. As the security officers escorted Karen away, the young woman couldn't help but wonder what had transpired. Had the airline filed a formal complaint against her? Or had she perhaps harassed or threatened one of the other passengers? Regardless of the specifics, the young woman knew that Karen's reckless actions had finally caught up with her. She couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, knowing that the woman's entitled behavior would no longer be her problem. As she collected her luggage and made her way out of the terminal, the young woman couldn't help but reflect on the events of the flight. It had been a harrowing experience, but in the end, the airline staff and the captain had stood their ground, refusing to cave to Karen's demands. The young woman couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude towards the crew, who had handled the situation with professionalism and compassion. They had not only ensured her own comfort and safety, but they had also set an example of how to stand up to entitled behavior in a firm and dignified manner. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, the young woman couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. She had weathered the storm of Karen's entitled behavior, and she knew that she had emerged stronger for it. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was confident that she could face them head-on, with the same resilience and determination that had carried her through this ordeal.